The most effective United States carrier-borne air armada ever sent into action prepares a surprise blow against the powerful Japanese naval base at Truk. Bombers, torpedo planes, and Hellcat fighters stand ready for the takeoff as their 2,000 horsepower engines warm up. The fleet is close to the enemy's secret stronghold now and still undetected. The first flight moves to the attack. The exact number of carriers in this great fleet is a closely guarded naval secret, but an overwhelming force of planes roars into the sky, the finest planes and the greatest flyers in the world. There goes the spearhead of the attack. The defending Japs are stunned by the suddenness of the first blow delivered with crushing force on the heart of the great fortress in mid-Pacific. Like Hitler's Europe, Tojo just forgot to put a ceiling over Truk, and jubilant Navy cameramen take pictures to prove.
Today, the Lagoon bears little resemblance to those devastating scenes of destruction witnessed during the battles which raged over its shores during the American attacks of Operation Hailstone. Vegetation has covered the scars left by the bombing, and little seems to remain of the infrastructure which was built during the 20 years of Japanese occupation, at which time the Lagoon was transformed into an impregnable supply and repair base for the Imperial Navy's fleet. The grounds of the dive resort in particular are well maintained, and apart from a few defensive gun emplacements, little remains to remind visitors of the atoll's turbulent history. It was due to one man's foresight, an islander by the name of Kimui Isek, who established a scuba diving industry based around the vessels sunk during the World War II raids, that the islands of Truk Lagoon have now been acknowledged as the Mecca of wreck diving. "5,000 divers a year travel to these remote islands from all over the world to see for themselves the remains that lie on the bottom of the lagoon, and which have been basically undisturbed since those fateful events 68 years ago. Each day, divers travel out into the lagoon in their assigned boats, crewed by Chuukese navigators and dive guides, whose knowledge of the area is both extensive and accurate. There were no surface buoys to mark the wreck positions, and they don't use GPS either. Local knowledge and landmarks guarantee they found the wreck every time. Most of the diving was carried out with twin rigs or side tanks, and it was only due to the assistance given by our crew that enabled many of us to complete 2 to 3 dives a day. Our only effort was to turn up and step on the boat. The gear had already been assembled and placed on board. All we had to do then was slip into it and fall over the side. The first dive often comes as a surprise to the uninitiated diver when they realise that at first glance the vessels no longer resemble ships at all, but reefs. The the man-made angles and straight lines have been softened by soft and hard corals, and the diver's eyes are drawn to the colours and shapes of nature's random architecture, disguising the stark shapes of the ships beneath. Eventually, the divers are drawn to the most recognisable of ship structures, the bridge. Generally, the bridges of wrecks are the first target of souvenir hunters, but in Truk the vessels have remained basically undisturbed. Brass helm rings lay where they have fallen when the wooden wheels they held together disintegrated, and the telegraph often echoes the captain's last command. But it's in the holds of these vessels that the stark realities of the era in which they served are brought sharply into focus. Truk, under the Japanese, was a major supply and repair base. Consequently, the freighters that were anchored here in those fateful days of early 1944 carried vast quantities of war supplies of every description. Here, in the Sankisan Maru, thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition carpet one level of the hold. The boxes which once contained them have mostly rotted away. In another area, thousands of small glass containers, their packing also long gone, lie in another section of the hold. With no labels to identify them, their purpose and original contents remain a mystery. The remains of vehicles are a common sight, still lying where they were shipped, straight from their manufacturers, never to be used. most of the vehicles seen appear to be general-purpose transports, while others are specialised equipment such as road rollers and bulldozers, destined for use in the construction of roadworks and airfields around the islands. Here, another collapsed cargo of unidentified glass objects, lying on what appears to be a layer of portable gas cylinders. And of course, sake bottles, which are found everywhere on every wreck you visit. Rolls of harmless electrical cable, complete with insulators, lie next to a more dangerous layer of artillery shell casings. And close to those, the distinctive shape of an aircraft radial engine, its cylinder cooling fins still recognisable between the pushrod housings and accumulated debris. Cockpit and fuselage sections of a Mitsubishi Zero fighter, which would have been assembled on a Truk airbase, lie corroding at the bottom of the hold. Destined never to fly, they joined the other 250 Japanese aircraft that were destroyed during the hailstone raids, most of them on the ground. Back on the upper decks, the colours of rust and decay are once again replaced by the vivid array of nature's mantle. Although the superstructures of the wrecks were inhabited by thousands of juvenile fish, very few large adults were encountered during these dives. The islanders still carry out subsistence living, relying on fishing and homegrown vegetables and fruit to survive, so it's not surprising the larger fish population has declined. The corals, though, seem to thrive, disguising even the most recognisable of objects, such as this stern telegraph. Even the deck-mounted gun on the stern of the Fujikama Maru is difficult to recognise through its cloak of corals and fish. Hainan Maru is the largest of the wrecks in Truk Lagoon, and came to world attention when Jacques Cousteau filmed her in the 1970s. Already damaged by bombers on the first day of the operation, she was eventually sunk by torpedo hits on the second day, and now lies on her port side in 36 metres of water, making her large propeller easily accessible to divers. Once a passenger liner, she was converted during the war to a submarine tender, supplying and maintaining the submarines under the command of the Sixth Fleet. Evidence for this can be found bolted to storage brackets along one of the Haian's companionways, where several spare submarine snorkels and periscopes of various sizes can be found. Periscopes with the small apertures are the attack periscopes, and the larger type were used for general or night work. Moving deeper inside to the forehold, more evidence of the Haian's wartime role can be found. The remains of torpedoes, said to be the formidable Long Lance, a 24-inch weapon considered superior to the Allied counterparts, which could deliver a 1,000-pound warhead at up to 49 knots with a range of nearly 11 miles. However, the advanced state of corrosion of the casings reveals what appears to me to be batteries, so at least some of them may have been the Type 92 electric torpedo, also commonly used throughout the war. So much diving still to be done, even a tropical rainstorm with its biting rain striking the divers like bullets from a gun could do nothing to dampen our enthusiasm as we push forward to Iten Island, known by its shape as the unsinkable aircraft carrier, to experience a different kind of wreck diving. Runways have now been reclaimed by vegetation, and the only visible reminder of its wartime role is the seawall, constructed from basalt rock that still surrounds it, although even that has been breached in places by the bombing. It was off these shores we were to dive the first of the aircraft wrecks. The Mitsubishi G4M3 attack bomber. The Allies codenamed it the Betty, but the crews that flew it knew it as the Hamaki, or Japanese for cigar, due to the rotund shape of its fuselage. They were to build more of these aircraft than any other Japanese bomber during World War II. The Betty was armed with two 7.7mm guns in the nose, one behind the cockpit and another on both sides of the fuselage behind the wing, as well as a 20mm cannon in the tail. It may have been well armed, but unfortunately for the crew, it had no armour plating for protection. The fuel tanks were built into the wings, but they were not explosion resistant, as the self-sealing variety were heavier and would have reduced the aircraft's range. Mitsubishi also incorporated this same design into their Zero fighters for the same reason and for the same ultimate result. Both aircraft had unprecedented range, but were extremely vulnerable to enemy gun and cannon fire. In fact, the Betty was so prone to ignition, when hit, it was given the nickname the Flying Lighter. Initially, the aircraft was very successful. They served all over the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and early in the war were responsible for the destruction of the Clark Field Air Base in the Philippines in 1941, and took part in the sinking of HMAS Prince of Wales and Repulse off the coast of Malaya that same year. But as the war moved on and the Allied fighter strength increased, the Betty became more vulnerable, so much so that Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor raids, was killed along with his entire staff when the two bombers they were travelling in were brought down by US Lightning fighters. Later on, toward the war's end, the Betty was also modified to carry the formidable kamikaze piloted aircraft codenamed Cherry Blossom, which wreaked so much damage to the US fleet at Okinawa. The fate of this Betty is unknown, but its end was traumatic enough to separate the engines from the rest of the aircraft when it came down. They can now be found 50 metres forward of the plane, their propellers the only things to distinguish them from the coral which encrusts them. Our next target was the Kawanishi H-8K seaplane, lying upside down close to the island of Iten and codenamed by the Allies as Emily. The boat shape of the aircraft's hull is immediately apparent. The Kawanishi H-8K was the fastest and most heavily armed seaplane to enter service during World War II and was considered by the Allied pilots as the most difficult to shoot down. It was well armed, with 5 20mm cannon and 7 machine guns, and unusual for Japanese aircraft, it was also well protected with armour plate and was equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks, allowing it a better chance to survive an attack. Although superficially resembling the British Short Sunderland flying boat, it was larger and had a much greater range of 4,400 nautical miles. Later production aircraft were also fitted with the ASV, or air-to-surface vessel radar, and these were particularly effective in the long-range reconnaissance and attack role, where they were known to have sunk several US submarines. Here the remains of the elevators can be seen, where they join the lower windows of the tail gunner's position. The base of the rear turret clearly shows the aft section of the seaplane's keel. The facts leading up to the demise of this particular aircraft are fairly well documented. It was travelling east from Palau on its way to the seaplane base at Dublin Island when it was attacked by US fighters. The aircraft was badly damaged, and most of the passengers on board, including several high-ranking Japanese officers and the co-pilot, were killed. Somehow the pilot managed to lose his attackers in the cloud and limped onto Truk, where it crash landed. From the evidence on the lagoon floor, it must have been a spectacular crash. The inner propeller blades are bent forward, which could only have happened if the aircraft was moving backwards as it hit the water. It is thought the plane nosed into the sea as it tried to land and flipped over on its back, breaking into the major sections we see today. Despite this, documents say the remainder of the crew was saved. Today the remains have become another sanctuary for fish and other marine creatures, sheltering in the soft corals that cling to the structure that once supported the floats of this remarkable flying plane. Only a few examples of this particular type of aircraft survived the Pacific conflict. The word penetration was heard a lot over the evening meal table, and of course the large engine rooms of many vessels such as the Kensho Maru enabled divers to explore these cavernous areas with ease. Undamaged, they afforded the divers the luxury of inspecting the remains of machinery in relative safety. Here, what I assume to be an engine, on closer inspection, may be an air compressor used to provide the necessary power to turn the main engine over and start it. Whatever it is, it has 3 different sized cylinders, lending credence to the compressor theory. Moving around in the ship's companionways may seem an easy and safe task, but the unwary can quickly find the ship may want to hold on to its visitors. This becomes more apparent as the penetrations become deeper and more confined. Debris hanging down from the overheads creates a maze of entanglement to be avoided, and not always successfully. Several divers in a confined space can quickly reduce the visibility, as in this workshop space, where a lathe and other metalworking machinery exudes a cloud of rust with every movement of a diver's fins. In other penetrations, where the vessel lays on its side or has been badly damaged by explosion, keeping a mental note of where you are and the way out is not easy, especially if your only means of illumination is your torch. With everything on its side, orientation and avoiding entanglement is a constant problem. Not a place for the faint-hearted either, as you never know what will be uncovered in the darkness. A stark reminder of an horrific and turbulent past. Here, more human remains lie on an operating table in the Shikoku Maru. And in the next compartment, a more enjoyable reminder of human pursuits, a Japanese bath, a common sight on most vessels. Meanwhile, on the decks above, thousands of artifacts await the diver's inspection. This first aid box catches most divers' attention. Looking at the number of sake bottles lying around, I would assume it was well stocked with headache tablets. And over everything, nature's attempt to reclaim it for herself and convert the results of a man-made disaster into a living artwork. If I were asked to choose which dive most affected me, it would be a hard decision to make, but the San Francisco Maru would surely rate somewhere near the top of the list. Deeper than most of the other wrecks, little growth covers the skeletal remains of its fire-damaged superstructure. But the holds, now starting to collapse with the weight of their cargo, still contain row upon row of once lethal mines. Specialised containers for some kind of ordnance still line the front of the hold. The bow gun, still trained on an unseen target off to the port side, is considered an icon by Truk underwater photographers. But for me, the sight of the two battle tanks huddled together on the deck against the forward bulkhead epitomised the total ethos of the Truk Lagoon experience. As divers, we may revel in the spectacle provided by the wartime wreckage, but as people, we should never forget the cost suffered by thousands in its making.